"You used to shine," my husband said. "But now you're just a dull shadow that mops floors." I didn't respond. I wiped the last streak of water from the kitchen counter and placed the rag neatly over the sink. The gala was in 2 hours. I wasn't invited, but I'd ironed his tuxedo, polished his shoes, and triple-checked his cufflinks were engraved the way he liked RC for Raymond Carter. I hadn't been called Elizabeth in months. He referred to me as her or the lady who cleans. I was his wife, but somewhere along the way, that title became ornamental, like a faded photograph you pass by without noticing. When we pulled up to the Grand Whitmore Hotel, he handed me his coat and said, "Wait by the service door. There might be something for you to do inside." So I did. I stood under the yellow glow of the back corridor lights, the same ones that buzzed faintly like distant regret. A junior staffer handed me a tray of hors d'oeuvres. I didn't argue. It wasn't the first time I'd carried food through a ballroom meant for others. My feet ached in old flats as I weaved through laughter, diamonds, and gowns worth more than our mortgage. That's when I heard it. A voice I hadn't heard in decades. "Elizabeth." It stopped me cold. "Is that really you?" I turned, and standing under a crystal chandelier was Jonathan Blake. Jonathan. I hadn't seen him in over 40 years. His hair had grayed at the temples, but the sharpness in his blue eyes hadn't changed. He took a step forward, his voice lowering. "I thought you were in Europe. After graduation, you just disappeared." My lips parted, but no words came out. My hands clutched the tray tighter. Raymond appeared beside me, his arm brushing mine without acknowledgement. "Is there a problem?" he asked Jonathan with the stiff politeness he reserved for men in better suits. Jonathan's eyes flicked to Raymond, then back to me. "This woman," he said softly, "helped me through my father's death. She edited every paper I ever wrote in college. She was the brightest mind in our year." Raymond laughed. "She serves canapés now. Time changes people." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "So does neglect." I couldn't breathe. Every cell in my body was humming, but I stood still. After Jonathan left, I excused myself to the restroom. I didn't cry. I looked in the mirror and saw her, Elizabeth Carter. She was still there, buried under 26 years of silence, 3 miscarriages, 1 breakdown, and an endless string of Tuesday meatloafs. My name still meant something to someone. To him. And maybe, just maybe, it could mean something to me again. The next morning I made coffee in silence. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual, and the sun coming through the window felt artificial, like stage lighting on a play I no longer wanted to perform in. Raymond had left early, claiming he had a meeting, but his cologne still lingered in the air. I stood at the sink watching the steam rise from my mug, and for the first time in years, I wondered what my life would have been if I had taken a different turn. I used to dream in color. Books, students, papers, debates. I had been offered a position at a university once. That version of me wore soft blouses and asked difficult questions. Now I wore silence like a second skin. That afternoon, I opened the cedar chest in the back of the closet. Inside were the letters. I had saved every one from Jonathan. From the year we graduated until the month before I married Raymond. His handwriting, still bold, still curved like someone who knew where they were going. He had written about starting his company, about his mother's garden, about how he never forgot our long walks after class. I read them slowly, letting each word stretch across my memory. One letter ended with, "Wherever you are, I hope you never stop shining." I closed the lid gently, afraid the air would damage something precious. The next day I walked to the library. Not the new one downtown, but the old branch by the river with the creaky floors and the dusty card catalog that no one used anymore. I had volunteered there once, before marriage became my full-time occupation. I asked the librarian if they needed help. She looked surprised, then smiled and said they always needed help. I spent 2 hours shelving books. No one called me maid. No one barked orders. I simply moved from one aisle to the next, placing stories where they belonged. On my way out, I stopped by the bulletin board. There was a flyer for a community writing class Thursdays at 6. The image was a pencil turning into a tree. I took one. At home I found Raymond in his chair watching television. He did not ask where I had been. He rarely did. I made dinner, the same chicken casserole he liked. When I placed the plate in front of him, he nodded without looking away from the screen. As I sat across from him, I realized something. I had been disappearing in pieces. Quietly. Like fog burning off at sunrise. Not with screams but with agreements. With silence. With "it is fine." I had become background noise in my own life. That night I pulled out an old notebook and wrote the first sentence in over 20 years. It was shaky, a little uneven, but it was mine. I wrote about the gala. About Jonathan's voice. About the way he said my name like it still meant something. Elizabeth. Not her. Not the woman who cleans. But Elizabeth. I wrote until my hand cramped. And when I closed the notebook I did not hide it. I placed it on the nightstand next to the lamp where I would see it in the morning. Something had begun. Something small. But it was enough. The next Thursday, I arrived at the community center 10 minutes early. The classroom smelled like pencil shavings and old ambition. There were 7 of us seated in a semicircle. Some gray-haired, some not. A woman named Marlene introduced herself as the facilitator. She smiled like someone who had forgotten what disappointment felt like. She handed out prompts typed on thick paper. Mine read, "Write about a time someone saw you clearly." I stared at the words. My pen hovered over the page. And then I wrote, "He said my name like it was music." That night I stayed after class. Marlene read my piece and looked up slowly. "Would you like to read this aloud next week?" I nodded before I could overthink it. On the walk home the air felt different. Lighter. The leaves had started to fall, and the streetlights caught them mid-spin. At home, Raymond was asleep in his recliner. The television flickered over his face. I turned it off, pulled the blanket over his shoulders, and stood for a moment, watching him snore softly. There was no hatred. Just a quiet ache for everything we had not been. Poured myself tea and opened my notebook. The pen moved faster this time. Words flowed. Paragraphs took shape. The next day I received an email. The sender's name made me pause. Jonathan Blake. I opened it slowly. The message was brief. "It was good to see you. I hope you are well. If you ever want to catch up over coffee, I would be honored. No pressure. Just curiosity. Yours truly, Jonathan." I stared at the screen. My finger hovered over reply. But I closed the laptop instead. Not yet. That evening Raymond mentioned the gala. "What did that man want from you anyway?" he asked over dinner. I kept my voice even. "He remembered me." Raymond scoffed. "Well, he must be bored. Rich people always get sentimental when they see old faces." I said nothing. Silence had become my armor. The next writing class I read my piece aloud. My voice trembled at first, then steadied. When I finished, the room was quiet. Marlene clapped. Others did too. But it was not the applause that stayed with me. It was the woman beside me, Sheila, who leaned over and whispered, "I hope you keep writing." That was something real. On my way out, I passed the bulletin board again. A new flyer was pinned beside the writing class announcement. Local voices. An evening of readings seeking participants. My fingers brushed over the edge. I took one. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My silver hair was tied back neatly. My blouse still had a faint crease from ironing. But my eyes looked different. Awake. I whispered my name out loud. Elizabeth. Just to hear it fill the room again. It no longer felt like an echo. It felt like a beginning. The evening of the reading arrived quietly, without ceremony. I chose a navy blue blouse with pearl buttons and pinned a silver brooch at my collarbone. It had belonged to my mother. As I stepped out the door, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not confidence exactly, but the absence of fear. The event was held in the library's old auditorium. The chairs were mismatched, the podium scratched, and the microphone buzzed faintly when tapped. But there was something honest about the space. People filed in slowly, chatting in low tones. I took a seat in the second row, program in hand. My name was printed in neat type. Elizabeth Carter. The sound of my name. When they called me, I stood without hesitation. I walked to the podium, placed my paper flat, and looked up. The room waited. I began. My voice was clear, not loud, but certain. I spoke of quiet rooms and forgotten names. Of coffee left cold and letters unread. I spoke of a woman who once laughed easily, and how she learned to fold herself into smaller and smaller corners, until there was barely anything left. I ended with a sentence I had not written until the morning of the reading. And then someone said my name, and I remembered I was still here. The silence after was thick. Not awkward. Full. When applause came, it was warm and real. Marlene hugged me tightly. You reminded us all of something, she whispered. A young woman approached me afterward. Her eyes were wet. That could have been my mother, she said. Thank you. I walked home under a soft drizzle, my coat buttoned up to my chin. I carried no umbrella. The rain felt gentle like permission. Raymond was watching a game when I returned. He glanced at the clock. Late night, he said without interest. I nodded and went upstairs. I did not explain. In the bedroom, I opened the top drawer of my nightstand and placed the program beside the notebook. I left the drawer slightly open. The next morning I brewed coffee and sat by the window. The rain had stopped, and the world looked freshly painted. I heard Raymond come down the stairs. He poured himself coffee, sat across from me, and said nothing for several minutes. Then, without looking up, he asked, "What was the reading about?" I studied his face. The lines around his eyes had deepened. It was about finding your way back to yourself, I said. He nodded once, then returned to his mug. That afternoon another email arrived. Jonathan, I saw your name in the local bulletin. I wish I could have been there. If there is a next time, please let me know. I meant it, Elizabeth. Your voice matters. I read the message twice, then replied, Thank you. I think I am starting to believe that too. I clicked send. Then I stood, walked to the mirror in the hallway, and looked at myself the way you look at someone you are just beginning to know again. 1 week later, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter. Handwritten in ink that bled slightly at the edges. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, the kind used for weddings or condolences. My name was written in looping script, Elizabeth Carter. Inside a single page. Jonathan had been invited to speak at a literary symposium 3 towns over. He asked if I would attend. Not as a guest. As a fellow speaker. My hands trembled as I read it. Not from fear. From disbelief. I set the letter on the counter and stared at it while my tea went cold. That afternoon, I called the library to ask Marlene what she thought. She gasped so loud I had to pull the phone back. You must go, she said. Elizabeth, people need to hear what you have to say. I smiled and said I would think about it. But I already knew I would go. That night I told Raymond. He was watching a documentary about war, something with black and white footage and gravelly narration. I sat beside him and waited for a quiet moment. I have been invited to speak at a symposium, I said calmly. It is in 3 weeks. I will need to take the train. He blinked at the screen, then turned to me slowly. Are you serious? I nodded. He scoffed, not unkindly, just puzzled. And what exactly are you going to talk about? I met his gaze. My story. He did not argue. He simply turned back to the television, and I understood that his silence was no longer my prison. It was just silence. In the days that followed, I prepared my piece. I rewrote paragraphs, trimmed sentences, added breath where I had once added apology. I practiced in front of the mirror, then in front of Marlene, who clapped and wiped her eyes when I finished. The morning of the symposium, I packed 1 small suitcase. I wore a dark green dress with a soft scarf and low heels. At the station, I found a window seat and folded the letter in my lap like a talisman. The train moved through towns I had never stopped in, fields just beginning to thaw, and lakes reflecting skies that did not know me. At the symposium, I was given a lanyard with my name and the word speaker beneath it. I ran my thumb across the letters, letting the weight of them settle in. Jonathan met me in the lobby. He looked older in the morning light, but his smile was the same. You came, he said, and I nodded. Thank you for asking. He introduced me to others, editors, writers, students with pens behind their ears. No one asked what I did for a living. They asked what I wrote about. That evening I stood at the podium. My voice did not shake. I spoke of stillness, of forgetting and remembering, of the quiet power in reclaiming your name. When I finished, there was no thunderous applause. Just steady clapping, a few nods, and one woman who placed her hand on her heart. Afterward, Jonathan handed me a glass of water. You were magnificent, he said. I thanked him and we sat together near the back of the room, watching the next speaker. He did not ask me what came next. He only said, "Whatever you choose, you will not be invisible again." On the ride home, I watched the sunset blur through the train window. I did not feel triumphant. I felt real. When I returned home, the house looked the same, but something in me had shifted. I placed my suitcase by the door and walked straight to the kitchen. Raymond was seated at the table, reading the newspaper. He looked up. "How was it?" he asked, not unkindly. "It was important," I said. He nodded and I waited, but there was nothing more. I did not need more. The next morning I resumed my usual routine. I watered the plants, swept the porch, folded laundry. But everything felt lighter, as if the air itself had decided to take up less space. I began spending more time at the library. Marlene introduced me to a retired teacher named Carol, who ran a small book club for women over 60. They invited me in. We read novels and memoirs and sometimes just talked. It was not glamorous, but it felt like belonging. One afternoon, Carol mentioned a local publication accepting short stories. I submitted one. It was called The Window Seat. I used my real name. A month later, I received an acceptance letter in the mail. It was not a glossy magazine. It did not pay, but it carried my words. I placed the issue on the coffee table where Raymond could see it. That evening, he picked it up without a word. I watched his eyes move across the page. When he finished, he looked at me. "Did this really happen?" he asked. I nodded. He did not say much after that, but he left the magazine open, facing up. Some nights I would find him rereading it, quietly, without commentary. I did not interrupt. I did not expect praise. One morning he surprised me. "Are you going to write more?" I turned to look at him. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." He nodded once, then poured himself a second cup of coffee. That was all. But it was enough. I began writing daily. Not always about myself. Sometimes fiction. Sometimes fragments. But I filled notebooks one after another. The house filled with the sound of pen on paper, of thought returned to motion. I bought a desk at a second-hand store and placed it near the window. It was small, with one drawer that stuck slightly, but it was mine. One afternoon, while organizing some old boxes in the attic, I found a photograph. It was of me at 22, standing on the steps of the university library, books in hand, eyes bright. I framed it and placed it on my desk. Not to mourn who I had been, but to honor her. She had waited patiently. She had never left. One Sunday, Raymond invited me to lunch. Not just out of politeness, but intentionally. He suggested a little diner near the lake. We ate quietly, but it was not the silence of strangers. As we waited for dessert, he said, "I think I forgot who you were." I looked out the window at the water. "I forgot too," I said. And we let that truth rest between us like a shared meal. Something warm, something healing. Later that week, I received another letter. The same cream-colored envelope. Another invitation. This one from a regional conference focused on women's voices in later life. They wanted me to share my work. I did not hesitate. I accepted. I printed my name clearly on the reply card. Elizabeth Carter. Fit perfectly. The conference was held in a restored theater with velvet seats and high ceilings. My name was printed on the second row of the program, just below a woman who had published 3 memoirs and above a professor from Vermont. I did not feel small. I felt placed, positioned. The morning was filled with panels and laughter in the hallways. Women in cardigans and bright lipstick shared stories in line for coffee. When it was my turn to speak, I walked onto the stage with my notes tucked in a blue folder. I wore the same green dress, pressed and simple. The spotlight was warm but not blinding. I read a new piece titled The Long Return. It was about silence but not the absence of sound. The other kind. The kind that grows between people who once shared everything. I spoke slowly. Not for effect, but because every word had weight now. When I finished, there was a pause. Then applause. And something else. Stillness. A reverence I had never expected to receive. Afterward, a woman in her 60s approached me, clutching her purse. She said her name was Helen and that she had been a nurse for 35 years. "You put something into words I have never been able to say," she told me. I hugged her gently. In that moment we were not strangers. We were women who had carried too much in silence. Back home the days returned to their rhythm. But the rhythm was mine now. I submitted another story to a small literary journal. It was accepted. Raymond began asking about my classes, my deadlines. Not out of obligation but genuine interest. One afternoon, he handed me a brown envelope. Inside was a printout of local creative writing scholarships. "You should teach," he said. "You are good at this." I stared at the papers. They were not fancy. Just stapled sheets from the library printer. But they felt like a door being held open. I applied to one. Then another. A few weeks later, I received an email from the Adult Education Center. They were starting a short course on personal narrative, and needed an instructor. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. The first class was small. 5 women, all older, all unsure. I stood at the whiteboard with a dry erase marker and a pounding heart. "Tell me a moment that made you pause," I said. "Not a tragedy. Just a moment." One woman wrote about the smell of her mother's coat. Another wrote about the sound of toast popping up when the kitchen was too quiet. We read aloud. We cried a little. We laughed more. I walked home in the dark with my scarf wrapped tight and my notebook full. Raymond was waiting with a pot of tea. "How did it go?" he asked. I sat down, removed my gloves and smiled. "It felt like breathing," I said. He nodded and poured the tea. In silence. But not the kind I used to fear. The kind that holds space. The weeks passed like chapters now, each one with its own rhythm and purpose. I taught my class every Thursday, met with Marlene on Tuesdays to discuss readings, and wrote each morning before the house fully woke. The Adult Education Center offered me a second class, then a third. I accepted. It felt natural, like roots finally touching soil after searching too long through stone. One afternoon after class, I stopped by the cafe near the river. I had been going there more often lately, not to meet anyone, just to sit with a cup of tea and the quiet hum of life around me. But this time as I stepped through the door, I saw Jonathan at a corner table. He was reading, glasses low on his nose, and a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. He looked up and smiled before I could decide whether to stay or retreat. "Elizabeth," he said, as if the name still tasted fresh. "Join me." I sat. We spoke for over an hour. Not about the past but about the present. About writing and aging and how strange it is to be seen after so many years of invisibility. He asked if I was happy. I paused. "I am becoming," I said. He understood. As I walked home, the wind picked up and carried the scent of spring through the last remains of winter. Raymond was trimming the hedges when I arrived. He waved without pausing. It was a small thing, but it landed differently now. That evening, I told him I had seen Jonathan. He did not flinch. Just said, "He always had good timing." I laughed and he smiled, and that was the end of it. The next day, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a clipping from the local newspaper. It was a review of the conference I had spoken at, and my name was mentioned. Elizabeth Carter delivered a stirring piece on memory and identity that lingered long after the applause faded. Below that, in unfamiliar handwriting, were the words, "Keep going. The world is listening." I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. Stayed there like a compass. I started drafting a collection of essays. I did not have a publisher, but that was not the point. I was writing for the woman I had been. For the woman I was. For the women still waiting for permission to take up space. One morning while cleaning out the linen closet, I found an old apron. Faded blue with one strap mended and the smell of lemon still lingering faintly. I held it for a long time. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in a box marked "Donate." Some things, even if stitched with memory, no longer fit the person you are becoming. That evening, I wrote the dedication for my manuscript. To the silence that once held me. Thank you for teaching me how to listen. But I no longer need you. When I finished, I did not cry. I closed the document, stood up, and made dinner. The table was set for 2. The candles were lit. And my name was not just written on paper. It was alive in the room. Spring settled in slowly, coaxing blooms from branches and warmth from windows left open a little longer each day. I submitted the manuscript. It felt like dropping a pebble into a lake, quiet, but full of ripple. I did not expect much. I had learned to value the act itself, the doing, the showing up. Weeks passed, filled with teaching, writing, and walking through the neighborhood with a calm that did not need explanation. One morning while slicing apples for a pie, the phone rang. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered. A woman introduced herself as an editor from a small press in Oregon. She had read my manuscript twice. Her voice was steady, but her words held something like awe. "We would be honored to publish this," she said. I leaned against the counter, the knife still on the cutting board, the apple browning slightly. "Thank you," I whispered. She went on about next steps and timelines, but I only half heard her. My name. On a book. Not for vanity. For truth. For legacy. That evening I told Raymond. He sat quietly, nodding slowly. "You did this," he said, tapping the table for emphasis. "All of it." He reached for my hand and held it there. Steady. Real. I taught my last spring class the following week. I told my students about the book, about how their voices mattered too. We took a photo together, arms around each other, cheeks touching, eyes bright. I printed it and placed it beside my desk. A reminder of the room where courage had grown roots. The day the book released, I did not host a party. I went to the cafe by the river, ordered tea, and sat by the window. Jonathan arrived 15 minutes later, carrying 2 copies. He placed one in front of me and signed the inside cover. "To the voice that woke the room," he wrote. I opened mine and signed his copy in return. "To the mirror I forgot I needed." We toasted with our cups, and for a moment the world was still. Not empty. Full. The reviews came in slowly. Some from strangers. Some from women I had never met but who wrote as if they had known me their whole lives. One letter said, "Your words gave me back a part of myself I did not even know was missing." I placed that letter in a frame. On my bookshelf. Next to my book. The house is the same. The rooms still creak, and the tea still simmers slowly. But it feels lived in now. Not just by a wife. By a woman. A writer. A name spoken with intention. On quiet afternoons I walk through the park and watch the trees sway. Sometimes I carry a notebook. Sometimes I do not. But I always carry my name. Elizabeth Carter. A name that once whispered out of someone else's mouth and echoed back into my bones. A name that now belongs fully to me.